This is Arun Blair-Mangat. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Arun.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited for today. Thank you.
I'm excited too, and I'm particularly interested. I'm just sort of starting off by introducing what we're doing, and one of the things that I love about LGBTQ plus history is that it's like digging for truffles in a forest. And I think the subject of your talk is a perfect example of that
Today.
because of the way that I came across him and the way that you welcomed the chance of learning more about him. It feels to me like that our ancestors are tickling our tonsils and saying, come on, talk about me, because I'm there and I need to be heard, and my stories need to be heard. And this is the thing, isn't it, with LGBTQI history, is that it's often not just neglected, but it's often missed in mainstream history. Stories are overlooked because people don't notice that they might be queer, or they might be lesbian stories, or they might be, stories of intersex people. So, I mean, before we hear your talk, which I can't wait for, but before we do, I'd really like to know, what was the experience of discovering and unearthing this story like for you, Aaron?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like when you got in touch, I'm always keen to collaborate with you. I think you're fantastic. So when you sent the name across, and the fact that I didn't know, and I like to think that I'm relatively well versed with some of our queer heroes, and often some of the ones that are on the periphery and maybe forgotten about. So the fact that the name didn't ring any bells, I was like, I need to know about this person. Research just led to falling in love with his life story, really. Like, it's incredible, and I can't wait to share it. But it was really exciting for me because, yes, I had to mine kind of the depths of the internet, but it is out there, and there's biographies and there's footage and there's beautiful images. And I think it's just kind of about celebrating that and putting that front and center. And now more than ever, we really need to glow each other up and allow queer people to feel the sun on our faces, because we've existed in the shadows for so long.
Absolutely right. Yeah, that's right. Oh, very exciting. Good. And I think also, it's really important that not just that we research the history, but that we create about people, and we create fictions. We weave these stories into fictions so that people
Mm-hmm.
can hear them and find out about them, as
Mm-hmm.
that's how people will will learn. But also, how the fantasy world is a very rich and important way of filling in our history as well,
Yeah,
isn't it?
absolutely. And we should be allowed to be fantastical and wonderful and whimsical, because I think so often queer narratives or queer representation is rooted in trauma, but we're so much more than that. We're not defined by that experience, whether or not, you've had a traumatic moment coming out or you're living in trauma. I think it's still, we should be allowed to see queer joy in all of its colors and hues.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really important phrase, and one that we need to help us keep resilient and stay resilient as well, because many of our opportunities for sharing that joy are limited at the moment,
Mhm.
um, as with everyone. And, we need to just remember that joy is out there.
Yes.
So, I'm just going to see. I think that it's probably a good time to start with you if you are happy to begin. So, take your breath and over to you.
Can you all see this? All right. So, how is everyone? Well, actually, no one can speak right now. But anyway, I'm going to be talking to you about Alfonso Teofilo Brown, or more commonly known as Panama Al Brown. And he's a legendary queer boxing champion whose story's just never really been told. So I think now more than ever, it's really important that we illuminate him, luckily, in LGBTQI plus History Month. So let's get started. Ooh, there we are. So, Panama Al Brown was born on the 5th of July, 1902, in the beautiful seaport and city of Colon in Panama. And That's nearly 119 years ago, which is kind of crazy because you'll learn very quickly that this man was iconic, way, way ahead of his time. And we stand on his shoulders, thankfully and luckily. A lot of sports people do. So he was a professional boxer. He was a bantamweight boxer. For those of you that don't know, that means that he was extremely lean, like had very little fat. I mean, you have to usually weigh between 52.5 or 52.2 kilograms and 53.5 kilograms. So it's a very small margin. And at 6 feet tall, it meant that he was extremely, extremely light on his feet. The London Times actually observed of him a bantamweight, 71 inches tall, yet by some miracle of physique, perfectly proportioned. He was able to outreach all of his foes. He made use of a snappy, tantalizing jab and marvelous footwork, which we'll come to later on. That's important to know because that footwork helped him become a very graceful dancer. He incited his opponents to desperation and recklessness, and he would finish them off with effortless mastery. When pushed to it, he could hammer out a victory, and he was very often known for his knockouts. I think he won over 50 matches purely by knocking out his opponent, which led to him being, lauded in the history books later on. He's regarded as one of the world's best bantamweight boxers. But for various reasons I'm going to touch upon in this presentation, he is unfortunately hugely forgotten. So let's go back to the beginning where it all began. So like I said, he was born in Colon in Panama, and the US had very increased interest in the region at this time, which led to a rise of construction and roads being paved and a lot of investment. Social clubs were opening, and it was kind of a thriving scene in the region. However, the US presence also led to increased segregation. And as a result, Brown had to travel all across town to find one of the very few schools that allowed Black students, and it was a Blacks only school as well. So he was kind of very used to facing adversity and hardship from a very young age. And he was the son of a former American slave, and his mother was of French Caribbean descent. So he's this incredible, he experienced a lot of intersectionality in his life, obviously learning Spanish by being raised in Colon, but also his mother taught him French, his dad taught him English. He just was always so malleable, and that's just how he innately was. Unfortunately, at the age of 13, his father passed away. So he had a very tough upbringing, and a biography on Brown written by Jose Corpas states that he was born from a hard scrabble upbringing in the canal hard streets of Colon as a boy, then solidified in the concrete hard streets of Harlem as a young man. So like I said, adversity after adversity, hardship after hardship, but that didn't define him. I mean, look at him, he's amazing. Despite all of his hardships as a kid, he was able to find solace in a gym, and he would pound the bags with dingy pairs of Maynard boxing gloves. He learned to fight hard, and he learned to fight quickly. At the age of 19, the mere young age of 19, he became a professional boxer, and he was guided and managed by Dave Lumiansky. His first fight was in March of that year, and he won. He was victorious. By the end of that year, at only 20 years old, he had won the Panamanian flyweight title. And under a year later, he had his first fight abroad in none other than New York City, the Big Apple. And it's important to note that he actually rose very quickly to prominence within the boxing scene in the boxing world. And by 1925, he was viewed as, without a doubt, one of the best bantamweight boxers. I don't want to, in lieu of listing, his prolific wins and his battles and his victories, I think it's really important to note that he did have a really illustrious, storied, successful boxing career. And often that led to him breaking down a lot of racial barriers, because as an Afro-Latino boxer who became a champion, he was able to kind of defy stereotypes and prove to, unfortunately, very discriminatory practice that he could conquer. And on June the 18th, 1929, Brown made history by becoming the world's first Latin American world champion. But we're going to go back a few years. So I just finished in 29, but let's take it back to 1926, where his journey is continuing. So like I said, he's moved to New York and he's fighting, and he's looking for a bit more of an adventure. So he crosses over the Great Atlantic and ends up in Paris. Brown's first fight was in November 1926 in the beautiful French capital. And he loved it so much that he decided to remain there for most of his life. So in his Paris debut, he boxed like Muhammad Ali and he punched like Joe Louis. He had a right hand thrown like a spear in the third, and simultaneously dropped his opponent and the jaws of the ringsiders. People were shook. They were amazed by his depth, grace, and presence and power. After the fight, Brown hit the cobblestone streets and received congratulations everywhere across the city. In Paris, despite his race and his appearance, he was able to walk through the doors of pubs, clubs, bars. He was welcomed and celebrated. And this really heavily contrasted to the life he had come to know in America and in New York. His fights drew crowds the New York Times described as fashionable and dressed in evening clothes with a brilliant display of jewelry, ermine, and sables by the women. After his fights, he would often unwind playing the saxophone, which we'll also pick on later. And having learned French from his mother, as aforementioned, he was able to completely seamlessly integrate into the upper echelons of Parisian society. I mean, people like Pablo Picasso and Ernest Hemingway came to see him fight, and they were his peers, his contemporaries, his colleagues. He was very much part of the tapestry of the Parisian cool kids, which is just, my mind's blown. So let's unpack that a little. To some, he was a Parisian party boy. He spent a great deal of his life enjoying the adventures that the city offered. And it became a sanctuary for him, a chance to play and revel and be queer. And unlike in the US, which was so clearly divided on racial lines, Brown felt a sense of comfort, and he was welcomed in France. And I mean, the reality of the situation is, although his agents exploited him, he only received 25% of his winnings and his earnings. At one point, he was able to own racehorses. He had a mansion in Maison Lafitte. And he even said, I found an article that said he would send his outfits and his suits to London to get ironed, because he said that they don't know how to iron in Paris. And I feel like that's such iconic behavior, the fact that he was able to do that and thought that that was okay. That says it all. He was extremely well known for his elegance and his impeccable style of dress, which broke down the stereotypes. Like I said, he was able to kind of show that Black people are not homogenous, and we can come in all different hues and shades and colors and creeds and styles and essences. He felt at home among the Bohemians, dancing and singing and playing music, and he even led a cabaret house band. He moved along the people easily, like I said, as a speaker of many languages, and that really helped him to find a sense of identity that meant that he didn't stick out like a sore thumb. He could just flit from here and there and everywhere. But like I said earlier, his athleticism as a boxer lent itself wonderfully to him dancing. And when I was researching about this incredible icon, I learned that not only was he a nimble and graceful boxer, but he was a nimble and graceful dancer. He made his cabaret debut as a song and dance man at the Cantuis de Nos, and he even performed with Josephine Baker in her La Vue Negre. So let me show you this incredible clip. Just bear with me.
Messieurs, dames, après ce petit numéro musical, je vous donne une idée de l'entraînement que je fais pour mon prochain match au Vélodrome d'hiver. Merci.
chose that clip because I feel like it's the perfect embodiment of how he was able to marry his boxing prowess and his boxing skill with his passion for performing and music and his love of, cabaret performance. And I just think he's full of such vitality, especially in this clip. And we'll revisit, we'll talk about this later, but he was able to live a more authentic, truthful version of himself in Paris. And I think it's so important to note that he was innately free in some ways. But that being said, it wasn't all rainbows and roses. I think as he became more prolific in the city and became more well-known in parts of the city, whispers started to permeate about the lifestyle that he led. And he was seen as this incredible premier attraction of an extremely macho sport. But then when people realized that he started to frequent clubs and bars where women dressed as men and same-sex couples held hands, the rumor started to circulate and swirl. And the fans who had initially embraced him with open arms and celebrated him, as they caught wind of these whispers, they started to go and attend his fights and start to heckle and holler and boo, and they wanted him to lose. He was jeered, slurred, and spat on during his ring walks. And after one fight, Parisian fans surrounded him as he left the ring, and they beat him bloody and unconscious. The reason for the suspensions, the boos, and the hate on both sides of the Atlantic was all because of the sad fact, as they felt and they believed that he was gay, that their boxing champion was gay. And that was something they couldn't deal with and couldn't handle, and that breaks my heart. And on top of that, this was a cartoon made and depicting Panama Al Brown. It's around the time that Brown was a peerless fighter, but it shows him in a very problematic fashion, as almost, a lanky Sambo-esque caricature. And all the other contenders, who are all naturally white, they're imploring him to leave the United States forever. If we look at the cartoon, why don't you go back to France and stay? Let me use a horsewhip and I'll fight you. Guess I'll stop fighting till I get into the middle class weights. It kind of says it all, really. The cartoon was meant to portray Brown's excellence, not allowing anyone else to get a look in at the top of the tree. But Brown's race and the open secret of his sexuality did not endear him to everyone. And he developed a lot of haters. And unfortunately, the sad reality is that Brown would struggle to get top-notch opposition in the ring with him for the rest of his career, just because of the simple fact that he loved men and he was a Black Latin man. The initial cheers eventually developed and turned into jeers, and his re-entrances were met with profanity, racial slurs, and spit. But Panama Al Brown, he kept on. He kept on, he persevered, he was tenacious and defiant. In 1930, he won the IBU, which is the International Boxing Union, and he held that title until 1935, when he was beaten by Baltasar Sanchili at the Plaza de Toros in Valencia, Spain. After this defeat, he shifted his focus onto cabaret performance. As I showed you earlier, he was very good at that. But some of the sources that I came across actually said that this fight with Sanchili was fixed, and that his managers and team were all in on it, and they were drugging him with champagne in between rounds. And they allude very heavily to his defeat being fixed. So I think it's kind of important to know that even people within his team and some of the people that he held closest to him started to turn on him as they saw that this pillar of power and strength who was able to conquer and win was someone that they didn't necessarily want to be there just because of his race and his sexuality. The defeat was controversial. And like I said, Brown still triumphed in the face of adversity. He won countless titles. He fought for the NBA, which was the precursor to the WA. And he became a crowd favorite despite all of the hate that he received. And the endless torrent of discrimination was very, very strong. But Brown remained positive throughout the 30s. However, it must be noted that his story is deeply rooted and deeply defined by the racist and homophobic hate that he did receive. And the intersectionality of his brownness and his queerness meant that he felt double the prejudice. Not only did he have to overcome obstacles because of the racism at the time, he also had to stomach the incessant vitriol that people threw at him because he was gay. Brown sadly was stripped of his titles, the New York State Athletic Commission title and the National Boxing Association titles in 1934. And he largely remained an unrecognized champion as the homophobic press continued to attack him. Panamanians often have a saying that refers to someone who's famous or largely successful. And if they come on hard times, the Panamanians say, what goes up must come down. And this is really an apt description of what happened to Brown. When World War II kicked off in 1939, Brown finally relocated back to the US, and he actually ended up in Harlem, to be precise. And he did try to seek work in the cabaret field, which is something he felt so passionate about, but he did not find any. And he ended up returning to the boxing ring in 1942. Brown faced a lot of hardships at this time, and he turned to opium, the drug usage of opium. He developed an addiction, and he was really struggling on hard times. But Brown found love. Thankfully, beautiful, he found queer love. In a late chapter of his life, Brown returned to Paris, and he was an addict. He'd struggled, he'd lived a very complicated life in Harlem, but he moved back to Paris, and he was able to experience a grand, epic, beautiful love before he passed on. It just so happened to be with an icon in and of himself as well, the legendary Jean Cocteau, who is seen in this picture holding the extremely large parapluie en français, the umbrella of sorts, parasol. I just love this image. I love their styling. I love Jean Cocteau's hair. The two of them met in Paris and embarked on a lovely, beautiful long-term relationship. For those that don't know, Jean Cocteau was a French poet, a playwright, a novelist, a designer, a filmmaker, a visual artist, and a critic. He did it all, truly, Generation Slash, the OG. And he's the one who helped Brown to get clean and also resurrected Brown's boxing career and just resurrected his zest for life. Cocteau was extremely intrigued by Brown, and he was attached to the fate of this boxer because I guess Brown represented to Cocteau a sort of poet, this mind, sort of sorcerer of sorts, who carried between the ropes the perfect success of one of human's enigmas, which was the prestige of presence. And that's what Brown exuded. Brown became very close friends with the legendary Coco Chanel, who offered him her farm on the outskirts of Paris so that he could train himself back up to fight fit. And it was far away from many of the distractions that Paris offered, you know, the nightlives, the bars, the allures, the temptations. He was able to kind of focus. But I just think that's like legendary in and of itself, like conjuring images in my mind of Coco and Panama Al Brown conversing while Jean Cocteau, I don't know, is writing poetry in the corner. And it's amazing to me, it truly is. And the newspaper journal called Ce Soir asked Jean Cocteau to write articles. And they left it to his own devices to kind of choose what the subject of said articles would be. Jean decided that he would write a series of articles on Panama Al Brown, which were both poetic, fascinating, and invigorating. I mean, Al was a boxing god, really, you know, who's seen as this praying mantis. So every evening, a page was devoted to this legendary boxer. And it meant that managers had to start taking notes and start listening and reading. And Jean Cocteau was so smart and so clever to do this and so generous to do this. It eventually led and culminated in a match at the Southwark Staff, and they were hoping to fill, you know, the seats due to all of the publicity that Ce Soir garnered. And the stadium was packed. When Al Brown appeared, he was insulted, but his true friends, his peers, his contemporaries, and his fans turned out and they were shouting, "Poet, dancer, poet, dancer, poet, dancer." They were there to celebrate and see him be victorious. It was beautiful, and that was thanks to Cocteau. Cocteau described Panama Al Brown as a poem written in black ink. He was an unwanted champion, but he triumphed despite all the odds against him. Jean Cocteau also wrote a series of affectionate poems and articles about Panama Al Brown, mostly for Ce Soir, the journal I mentioned earlier. But one stated that Brown was so alien to the world of letters that he is almost more of a lyrical creation. That's such a beautiful sentiment. What's wonderful, and what I came across in my research, is that Panama Al Brown lives on in many of Cocteau's poetry. This is one I pulled up on the page, as seen here. It's an unpublished poem, but it was written at the day of Al Brown's rematch with Sam Chile. So, you know, the person I mentioned who beat him in the 30s, and it was meant to potentially a fixed match. Well, Panama Al Brown had a rematch and he was victorious. And La Balance is about that. Do excuse my terrible French accent, but I'm going to. Well, je peux parler en français un peu, mais okay. Contre la haine, l'ombre et le jeu des rapines, le calme, le destin, la couronne des épines. La franchise, la danse et le choc de départ, le raté à la fin, fatigue à leur part. La rage de la chèche, la victoire factice, et le couronnement de la justice. D'un côté, le désordre et l'altercation, et de l'autre, l'instinct de conversation. Cet instant, sous sa forme humaine la plus haute, victorieux du mal, du noir de la faute. L'âme blanche du brun, calculant et dansant, une danse des morts, de vengeance et de sang. Albin sortit vainqueur par la force des règles, car les voitures seront les victimes des règles. Le règne est vivant des hommes et des amis, et cet homme debout parce qu'il est promis. On sent pour acheter le drame de l'avance et la légèreté de bonjour la balance. And there's 4 lines I've highlighted that I just think are so beautiful and powerful and evocative. And the translation roughly is Brown's white soul calculating and dancing, a dance of death, revenge and blood. Al Brown emerged victorious by force of rules because the vultures will be the victims of the eagles. Oh my God, I mean, what words, what beautiful words. So he lives on, like I said, in Cocteau's legendary poetry. And whether or not it's celebrated or not, it exists, and it's up to us to, like I said, illuminate it and bring it back into the conversation. So that brings us to the final chapter, Brown's End. By the end, Panama Al Brown had been plagued with contract disputes, managerial disputes. There'd been lots of infighting and various different commissions and politics that came into play, on top of, like I said, the onslaught of racist, homophobic hate and vitriol that he faced from his peers and from the press. But his skills, the beauty of his boxing, it can't be overlooked, it can't be blurred by this. It shouldn't be it should never be painted over by the fact that he was able to triumph in what is still a very ugly fight business. And I'm not trying to say that, you know, he was this infallible man. Like, he had his own failings. Like I said, he had an addiction to opium. He had issues with his money, and he had issues with alcohol. He had his own recklessness. But he was still a beautiful, incredible emblem of Black, brown, queer triumph and joy. Unfortunately, the last few years of his life were spent in hospital and on the streets. And one cold night in 1951 in New York, a cop walked past down a street and poked his club at an unresponsive man lying on a bed of litter and on an old mattress. I think it was on Broadway, actually. They tossed him in a jail cell, and then when he didn't wake up, they rushed him to hospital. So when Jean Cocteau found out that Brown was actually on his deathbed, he recorded his memories of their time together and sent it over to New York via a contact he had at L'Equipe. And it arrived just in time for Brown to be able to hear before he passed away on April the 11th, 1951. He died of tuberculosis. He was extremely young, in my opinion. He had so much life left to live. But in his short time on this earth, he was able to, you know, create such a legacy and leave such a legacy, in my opinion. He has, however, now been inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. Panama Al Brown's final record is believed to have been 123 wins, 18 defeats, 10 draws. And like I said at the beginning of the presentation, he had over 50 knockouts, which is incredible, such an incredible feat. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it places him up there as one of the best bantamweights of all time. He's recognized as a world champion. He held the world champion record for 6 years. And although his titles were stripped away in the 30s, I think now, with the power of hindsight, people are really able to acknowledge just how hard he had to work in that climate and still thrive despite everything that he was faced with. So his legacy lives on. In 2002, Brown was named as one of the 80 best fighters of the boxing world. And the Ring magazine ranks him as number 5 as one of the greatest bantamweight boxers in history. He is often overlooked, too largely overlooked, but I really truly believe that he paved the way for so many. And we have to remember that Panama Al Brown was living in a time where consensual affections and love between same-sex people, same-sex adults was a crime. Many in science and medical professions believe that it, went against human nature. And, parents would drill holes, quarter-inch holes into their children's head, or put little things through the eye, the little hole, atropine inside eye picks, and they would encourage lobotomies. This was a climate and a time when gay equated to being a criminal is illegal. So the fact that he lived openly and queerly is just unfathomable and so beautiful to me, and so incredible that he was that bold and brave and paved the way. Being Black and being Latino, being gay at that time, it's a story that remains largely untold, and I feel like now more than ever we need to celebrate him and glow him up and celebrate his bravery and the fact that he had the guts to live out of the closet, even in some way, shape or form, regardless of whether or not it would damage his career, is something that's worth celebrating, regardless of what he achieved as a boxer. But that also was amazing, which is amazing. So he's a legend. He had the grace of a dancer, the power of an athlete, the force of a boxer, and the artistry of, an artist. I would say that he is the undeniable king of bantamweight. And not just because of what he did in the ring, but like I said, it's because of how he conducted his life outside of the ring as well. Who else is adept in several languages and rubbed shoulders with the Parisian elite from Picasso to Coco Chanel, had an epic love with playwright, poet, artist Jean Cocteau, and then achieved what he did as a boxer as well. That is so iconic. So yeah, that is Panama Al Brown. That's just touching the surface of his legendary life, but I hope it's illuminated it somewhat for you and inspired you to live a bit more boldly, queerly, and colourfully in yours. I'm going to end up there. We can open up some questions, but thank you for listening. Yeah, that's him. Oh.
Wow. I'm so blown away, Arun. I'm sitting here, my mouth is just dropping open. This is just some fantastic research, and but also I was really moved. We're getting lots of comments coming up, just really moved by his story and what he had to deal with, what he was up against, and he managed to be fabulous. The story of sending his ironing to England, I love it. What a diva!
It's so iconic. I was floored when you sent him to me, and I just couldn't stop. I have pages. I probably have about 10 pages, and I've had to cross through things for the time constraints. But
how do we not know about him?
How do we not know about him?
And I heard there was a rumor that Rihanna might be making a biopic about Josephine Baker, and I'm just thinking maybe the biopic, either that biopic has to have him in. I wonder who could play him, Arun.
Well, I got my black, I got my boxing gloves. We try out here, but I'm a 6'2", so I'm a little taller, but that means I used to just shed a bit of,
He needs a biopic, doesn't he? It's so rich. There's so much there. There's so much to tell.
So much.
I don't know I've got loads of questions coming through, and maybe we've just got time for a few of them. Somebody's asked about why he was stripped of his titles.
Well, from the research that I came across, it was literally just because they're like, we can't have this queer man beating these macho men in these rings and living his life in the way that he was. Because at that point, he'd gone to Paris, lived out and proud, amassed all of these friends, and then gone back to America. And they were like, and he was kind of going, he was flying around all these world competitions. So like I said, he would go down to Spain, he'd be in, I think he was in London at some point, he'd go to New York and fight, but he was based in Paris at this time. And I just don't think there wasn't even reasons, he was just stripped of his title.
Right, okay, so they didn't need a reason for this.
Maddening to me, but no one could fight or contest it because their way was the highway at that point.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, and look at like Colin Kaepernick now, how, you know, he's kind of expelled from the NFL. There's no reason. I mean, he was kneeling, making gorgeous political protests, and arguably his white counterpart could be like throwing vitriol on Twitter and there's no repercussions. So we still very much live in that climate where the limitations can be forced upon you because of the color of your skin.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And add on that queerness, and I mean, it's just a double-edged sword.
Yeah, yeah. Somebody has sent through a question asking about the main lessons that you feel. So they wanted to know how your journey of researching was, which is a bit of a longer, and we haven't got, well, we've got a few minutes. Just wanting to know what your main lessons you feel that he has to teach us.
Oh my God, so much. I mean, for me, I am an actor and a writer, and I feel like I always try and live as openly and authentically as I can. But reading about someone's life like this, the fact that they were able to, like I said, step out of the shadows and feel that sun, despite everything that had been handed to them. Like, I'm very lucky I grew up in London. Like, he grew up in Colón, Panama, at a time when the American investment was a guise for way other ulterior motives. So they didn't really care in actually investing in infrastructure that would elevate and enfranchise the people in the city and in the country. So, like I said, the fact that he would travel across town to go to school, but he had that fervor and that resilience to want to try and get some sort of education to be able to ameliorate his circumstances and feel and be fueled by his parents and their love, and then losing a father so young but still having the tenacity to go out and seek to better his life, fight, use his athleticism to enfranchise himself, and then move to New York, move to Harlem, and then do it all again and build up again. I feel like, and then move to Paris and do it all over again. I'm like, why are we, I mean, right now I understand that we're like rooted and grounded, but there needs to be that fluidity. We need to have that interplay, especially as within the queer community. I feel like sometimes we can be so segregated, and it's like white cisgendered men, gay men, and then like my lesbian friends in the acting world, like we all kind of have these little sets, even within the community, the artistic community that I exist in. And I'm like, why don't we do this way more and have that fluidity and that communication? Imagine what we could achieve as a tribe if we actually spoke transparently with one another. And
I hear you.
Looked after our trans sisters, our trans brothers, or
yes,
our, you know, our gender queer kids. Like, why aren't we doing that? Why are we so like, oh, I'm looking out for myself. Let me just, you know. I'm like, no. So I think you've really just bolstered me to do that tenfold.
Fabulous. Okay, so what was that? Resilience, fluidity, and fabulousness. I like that. Great. Someone's asked any links or books that you can recommend.
Yes. Okay. Read Jose Corpas's biography.
Okay, great. While you're just putting that in the chat, that would be brilliant. Somebody else has asked. Well, this is about the fabulousness, really, and just so it's not really a question, but I think you know, we touched on queer joy, and you know, thank you so much for that, bringing his joy and his fabulousness to all of us, and that beautiful reading of that poem. That was very lovely.
Thank you. My French is very rusty.
Yeah,
so apologies to any.
But I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, is really come across from this is that, you know, his way of dressing and his you know, style, that was actually what brought his story to my attention and then to your attention. So I feel like, see how that seed has come through. Somebody sent me a photograph, I think I told you this, of a beautiful woman, very stylish woman in the 30s with a leopard on a leash. And somebody had written in the chat of the link, I think that's Panama Al, and they'd recognized him from his fabulous Panama that he wore, his hat, and that's where I learned about his story, and I was just so I think we can take from this, Aaron, you know, keep on being fabulous.
To all of you.
All of you.
100%. Yeah. Style is amazing. True.
Yes. Thank you so much. I know you have to leave, but if you can stay for any of the next one, you'd be very, very welcome.